morning, all participants to the international conference. In a few minutes, we are going to start our today's schedule. And our keynote speakers is already here, and we will start soon. So for those of you who still lingering outside, you are more than welcome to come into the meeting room. And for those of you who haven't yet visited the book booth at the 7th floor downstairs, one step downstairs. Okay, there are many books that has been available from Silkworm, from Mekong Press, Taylor and Francis, White Lotus, yeah, and many more. For those of you who want to explore the new books that might be relevant to your interest, yeah, you're more than welcome to visit the book sale over there. So today it is our great honor to introduce you to the keynote speaker for today. And perhaps for those who are studying development or agrarian studies, perhaps you know better than me about Professor Jonathan Rigg. His name has become like a generic term for those diagnose the development, rural area studies, agrarian change, especially in the Southeast Asian region. Professor Jonathan Rigg has just been about 6 months with the National University of Singapore, but he is not a new face to Southeast Asian region. He used to be with Durham University in the UK for 20 years. He had done his fieldwork in Mahasarakham in the northeastern part of Thailand. His initial interest is in the area of agriculture. He has done his fieldwork not just in Thailand, but also in Laos, in part of it in a little bit in Singapore, in Kazakhstan, and many more. Later on, his interest, which is start with agriculture, expand to rural development and agrarian change, and later on about the migration and the influence of modernization and globalization, which reworking the aspiration and expectation of local livelihood. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Jonathan Rigg to come up on stage and to deliver his keynote address on the topic of the shadow of success and transformation and marginalization in Southeast Asia. Please.
Morning, everyone. I've got a presentation. I'm not sure if the... it's coming good. Right, well, while that's being set up, I'd just like to thank the organisers, Ajahn Chayan in particular, for inviting me here to Chiang Mai. It's wonderful to be back. Lots of familiar faces. So thank you to Ajahn Chayan, the wider team, and all the people kind of who are behind the scenes, making sure that we have a good time. It's, as ever in Thailand, fantastically organised conference. Oh, and look, a cup of tea. Thank you. Just what I need. Thank you. Okay, I've got... I know we're running a little bit late, aren't we? But we'll finish the session by 1:45, which will mean we'll be running 15 minutes late. Is that right? And I might hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions. Essentially, this presentation is, I'm trialing something on you. This is a book I'm in the process of writing. I had hoped that it would be further down the line than it is, as is always the case. And it's not going to be really about agrarian change, so I'm sorry about that if anyone's in here thinking they're going to hear more about rural development. Normally, I talk without notes, but in this case, because it's new to me, it may be not new to you, I'm going to, from time to time, look at my notes, so apologies for that. Maybe the third thing to say is that it's often imagined that as we get older, we get more conservative. And in my case, it seems to be working the other way around, to my surprise. And as I get older, I seem to be getting more bitter and more twisted in the way I think about things. So this paper may be a surprise to some of you who have read my earlier work, because I think the tenor of it is more critical, and I'm seeing sort of issues and problems and challenges which maybe 20 years ago I didn't see, or at least didn't see in quite the same way. Okay. On the face of it, Southeast Asia, East Asia, in broader terms, has been enormously successful from the point of view of development. And I guess that's best reflected in levels of poverty. As it's been said many times, never before in human history have more people been lifted out of poverty than they have in East Asia over the last half century. And this graph here shows that between 1980 and 2010, the number of people living in absolute poverty has probably fallen from around about 70% of the population to about 12%. Essentially what I want to do today, for the next sort of 30 minutes or so, is to suggest to you that this view of success is really contingent on how we think about the poor, how we conceptualize the poor, and how the poor are produced and reproduced over time. And that also means that, if you like, the policy interventions that might deal with poverty also need to be different. I'm going to suggest that there are 5 ways in which we can think about the poor in East Asia. I'm using East Asia to mean kind of Southeast Asia and East Asia, so the kind of World Bank view of East Asia, sort of, if you like, wider East Asia. These populations of poor occasionally overlap, but not always. And as I've sort of hinted, importantly, understanding who the poor are and why they're poor is going to have impacts in terms of the policies that might be shaped to address poverty. So the first poor, I call here rather clumsily poor 1.0. So the poor we're kind of familiar with and comfortable with. These are the meager poor. These are the poor who are said to be trapped in poverty. Their poverty is an inheritance of the past. And in a sense, they're poor because, so classically it's been said, they've missed out on development. And these people are measured in terms of those living on less than $1.25 a day. On this basis, there are a number of countries in this region where poverty has been eradicated. So Kishore Mahbubani said a few years ago that in Singapore there are no homeless, destitute or starving people. Poverty has been eradicated. The same has been said for Malaysia, where it's said that hardcore poverty is now a thing of the past. But as most of you will know, if we raise this threshold from $1.25 in the graph here to $2, suddenly, miraculously, many millions more poor appear. So, and I know many of you will be familiar with this, where we draw the line is really important. It's contentious, it's difficult to do, and it's also, of course, far from academic. Where we draw the line has impacts upon people. It's often assumed that the challenge of poverty in Southeast Asia lies with and in the region's poorest countries, so places like the Lao PDR, Myanmar, Cambodia. However, there are far more people living in poverty in middle-income countries in Southeast Asia than low-income countries. And that, so whether we draw the line at $1.25 or $2, that is the case. This distribution of the poor between low and middle-income countries is new. In 2005, across developing Asia, 69% of the poor lived in low-income countries. It's now 19%. This is not, of course, because a new stock of poor people have suddenly revealed themselves in middle-income countries. It reflects the transition of formerly low-income countries to middle-income status. This is, if you like, a regional incarnation of a new geography of global poverty, one where we need to pay attention to the partially obscured poor in what may well be rapidly growing and therefore so-called successful countries. And this concern for the poor in middle-income countries shifts the terms of the debate, I think more than geographically, from the so-styled bottom billion living in low-income countries to those living in middle-income countries. So these are in this table here, these are the poor that we're concerned with. So we should be looking at countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, now a middle-income country, Malaysia, where there are still important and large stocks of poor. When the poor were concentrated among low-income countries, it was usual to see poverty as a problem of low growth and underdevelopment. The solution to that was clear: encourage growth. The persistence of poverty in rapidly growing middle-income countries reflects something rather different, and I think rather more intractable. The question in these countries is, why do we not see an eradication of poverty in the context of rapid growth? And this kind of leads us into poverty 2.0. The standard answer to that question is that it's because poverty has been unequal, and therefore the long-standing debate upon pro-poor growth, shared growth, inclusive growth emerges from that. While poverty has declined across developing Asia, it would have been even steeper had growth been more equally distributed. 4/5 of developing Asia's population live in countries where inequality deepened in the final decade of the last century and the first decade of this century. Just give you two examples of the impact of this. These are sort of data for that period, so 1990 to 2010, for Indonesia and the Lao PDR. And what you can see in this graph is that it's the richest quintile who have seen their incomes growing very much more rapidly than the lowest quintile. So if you're going to sort of ask the question, what's the effect of that on poverty? These are the actual rates of poverty for the Lao PDR and Indonesia, and this is what they would have been if growth had been equally distributed. So the impact of the deepening inequality across this region, you can see that reflected in levels of poverty. The importance of addressing inequality that seems to be such a feature of economic growth in Southeast Asia is political as much as it is moral and humanitarian. And from this report by the ADB, they're kind of recognizing there's a political imperative to deal with unequal growth. Stark differences in the depth and pattern of inequality between countries indicate that the nature of inequality is shaped in market economies by much more than just the operation of the market. And that's something that Joseph Stiglitz has recognized when he writes about American inequality. American inequality didn't just happen, it was created. Market forces played a role, but it was not market forces alone. Our growing inequality is a distinctly American achievement. And I think we could replace America there with Thailand, with Indonesia, with the Lao PDR. So in other words, we need to look at the policies in the countries that we work in order to understand inequality. This case for pursuing growth with equity, or if you like, equity with growth, extends beyond its poverty-reducing effects. And there's been some really interesting work on the effect of inequality on violence, on mental illness, teenage births, obesity, educational outcomes, you name it, almost. And there are a lot of sociologists in this room who will know more about this than I do. The sociological implications of unequal growth extend far beyond just its income distribution ramifications. Also, poverty can be said not so much to have persisted, but to have been reworked in new forms through and by the achievement of development and a degree of material progress. This is what I kind of call poverty 3.0. To understand these poor requires us to study the non-poor, because it is in relation to the rich that they emerge, not so much in statistical terms, but in experiential terms. For the 3.0 poor, while they find their living conditions improving in real terms, they are... Can you hear me? Yeah, was it a bit hard to hear me? In real terms, they are unable to fulfill their aspirations to become fully contented neoliberal consumers, and they're frustrated in this desire. And this is a wonderful picture, in fact, not from Asia, from Latin America, of this kind of interface between the rich and the poor. It almost looks like two photos, but in fact it's one. So we have, if you like, the middle classes on the right-hand side in their apartment blocks, living just cheek by jowl next to informal housing. Then we get on to poverty 4.0, and this is where I think it becomes kind of more interesting. And this is poverty created by development through a parallel process of impoverishment. And for David Moss, he talks here about the poverty of certain categories of people being not just unimproved by growth or integration into global markets, but deepened by it. The more radical view of this process is that the forces of globalization exert downward pressure on wages as investment seeks out those locations where labor is cheapest. And there are a whole set of terms that have been coined to describe this process: immiserizing growth, competitive austerity, race to the bottom, not so friendly to labor, 3L, 3D development, and so on. I mean, these are terms which I imagine some of you here are familiar with. And although is often perceived to be a radical view, I've got at the bottom of this slide a quote again from Joseph Stiglitz, who of course Nobel laureate, chief economist at the World Bank. This is not someone at the margins of the debate. He was absolutely central to it. Wrote a couple of years ago, "With capital highly mobile and with tariffs low, firms can simply tell workers that if they don't accept lower wages and worse working conditions, the company will move elsewhere." And then we move on to poverty 5.0. These are the poor essentially who never enter the national statistics. They're not counted, and as I'll argue in a moment, they're not counted because they do not count. So we've got five broad types of poor. I'm going to deal with the, if you like, the last two in a bit more detail in a moment. We've got, if you like, the residual poor. These are the poor who have been sort of pushed to one side by processes of economic growth. They've been left behind, if you like. This is the poverty 1.0. Then we have the unequal poor. These are the poor, in a sense, who haven't benefited because of the unequal distribution of growth. They've fallen behind in various ways, and I call those poverty 2.0. Then we have the produced poor. So these are the sort of third and the fourth categories of poor. And to understand these poor, we have to see them in terms of capitalist transformation. They are the immiserated poor. And finally, we have the unreported poor. Broadly speaking, I think the countries of Southeast Asia have been good, and East Asia more broadly, very good at dealing with the residual poor. So poverty 1.0 has fallen sharply, whether it's measured at $1.25 or $2 a day. The unequal poor, well, that's becoming increasingly problematic because growth has become more unequal over the last 20 years rather than less unequal. But I think it's with respect to the third and the fourth categories, or if you like, the fourth and the fifth of my five types of poor, where I think the challenge really lies. And I want to spend the next sort of 15 minutes or so looking at those poors. A general point I want to make is that market integration, I guess capitalism, harms as well as hurts people. And I say that not just in a kind of rhetorical or discursive sense, but it actually creates poor people. And this is something that Barbara Harris-White writes about. I mean, she does most of her work on India, but I mean, I think we can kind of bring it into a Southeast Asian context. she writes, poverty cannot be eradicated. On the contrary, poverty is continually being created and recreated under the institutions of capitalism. But I think for this argument to have any credibility, and not just to appear to be political posturing or arising from ideological partiality, it needs to be grounded in examples that demonstrate the selectively harmful effects of the very processes and policies that have also produced prosperity. So there's kind of paradox here about how prosperity also creates poverty. And I think there are three key processes at work. There's a process of dispossession. And I attended one of the panels, in fact yesterday afternoon, where that came through fantastically in some of the papers. There's a process of dispossession. There are processes of displacement, removal of people from sites, from jobs, from work. And there's also a process of casualization, or what's increasingly called sort of precarity, attached to this type of work. So I kind of look at those three and show you how they operate. Of the countries of Southeast Asia, I think it's possibly the Lao PDR where debates over the developmental effects of large-scale land enclosure or land grabbing have been most vociferous, and there are a number of people in the room today who have worked on this. Studies in Laos reveal common threads in the way that such frontier spaces and people are characterized, that land is unused or inefficiently used, that upland peoples are backward and poor because of their adherence to traditional livelihoods, that their style of living does not contribute to national development, and that the best means to develop both the people and the land resource is through marketization. Both the Asian Development Bank and the Lao government have been instrumental in this characterization of large areas of the country as empty and undeveloped, thus creating a frontier space, if you like, a kind of fictive frontier that capitalism can exploit. The subtle morphing of unpopulated into underused and then underused into underproductive, often underpinned by notions of backwardness, are all too clear. Given that empty lands are rarely empty, to make space available for capital requires clearing it of people. In fact, I was at a workshop just before the end of last year at C4 in Bogor, where someone called Susanna Hecht, who works on Amazonia, said, "Forests without people are an invitation to plunder." And I think it's a sort of fantastic expression. This underpins the logic of dispossession. Only by dispossessing, uprooting, and resettling people can land be possessed by capital. There is a corollary effect, of course, of turning land into capital, and that is turning people into labor. And this is something that people like Ian Baird have worked on in the Lao PDR. Having uprooted people from their traditional lands, settling them in villages and thereby connecting them in a physical sense to the mainstream, these settlers can then be drawn into market relations. Only in this way can minority peoples, partially separate and separated from the market, contribute to national development. And we just don't only see this in the Lao PDR, we also see it in upland Vietnam, in Malaysian, Indonesian, Borneo, in Sulawesi, in West Papua, so it resonates across the region. I'm using Laos as a kind of exemplar of wider processes. So we've got kind of two things going on here. We've got a land effect. So we focus on land. We have depopulation, expropriation, enclosure, and capitalization. And then if we focus on the people, we have a kind of set of labor effects which intersect with that. We have displacement, resettlement, incorporation, and proletarianization. Having been physically displaced, the already vulnerable find themselves in new, even less secure employment situations. The casualization of work is seen to be one of the defining features of advanced capitalism, as countries are forced to compete with each other for mobile capital. The outcome is that economic growth is often not translated into security, indeed, often quite the reverse. I think a significant but often overlooked character of this trend towards increasing precarity is that it reverses the direction of travel of much of the 20th century. For much of the 20th century, there was the assumption that informalization would lead, with development, would lead to greater formalization. And there was that classic study by the ILO, which I quote up here, published in 1982, based on a meeting in Kenya, where they defined the informal sector. The informal sector was seen to be characteristic of poor countries, and it would disappear as countries progressed, modernized, developed. What we see, though, and this is the puzzle, is that actually informal work hasn't declined across Southeast Asia. It's growing. But what's happened is there's been a shift from an informal sector to an informal economy. And the puzzle, I think, is that in many countries of Asia, while labor legislation has become more comprehensive in scope, the actual experience of work has become less secure. A process of informalization has occurred in the context of development. And Chang calls this the informalization of the formal sector. And I've got a quote from that at the bottom, and I've got some data here on the expansion of the informal sector, or the informal economy, across Southeast Asia. This creation of what's been termed a precariat is occurring as nationals are incorporated within the capitalist system, but on unfavorable terms. But it's also occurring beneath the radar as transnational migrants increasingly fill the interstitial spaces in national economies. And this kind of brings me on to the unreported poor. Often data on migration and mobility, both international and transnational, are hard to pick up. I mean, national censuses often don't record these things. Migrants kind of ghost across national frontiers, particularly in the case of Thailand, into Malaysia and so forth. And so we don't actually know the actual numbers in sort of concrete, firm terms. But notwithstanding those caveats, we do know that socioeconomic and political transformations in this part of the world over the last 4 decades have served to create a vital landscape of human mobility. And there are 2 general circuits. Hang on. Stream. There are 2 general circuits, one centered on Thailand, if you like a mainland Southeast Asia circuit, with sort of Thailand at the hub of this process, and then one in island Southeast Asia, centered on Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei. So we have a kind of insular island situation. Now, obviously, the situation varies between countries, but that said, I think we can make kind of 4 general statements that have wider validity. First of all, workers are hired on a temporary basis. Secondly, they don't enjoy the same rights as citizen employees. Third, they're low paid, work in dangerous, difficult, degrading circumstances. And fourth and finally, they're situated at the mainstream, at the edges of mainstream society, so they're kind of classically socially excluded. The emergence of this vital regional human resource economy in Southeast Asia has led to something which I'm not quite sure whether this is going to work. Well, I've called it, for the time being, the triple paradox of the transnational migrant. And I'll kind of run through it. This is new. I'm not quite sure if this works, but anyway, I'll give it a shot. So, 3 paradoxes behind this. The first one is that migrants are often critical components in national development, essential for processes of capitalist accumulation, not least here in Thailand. But at the same time, they're only given a grudging welcome at best, and their presence is conditional. So if we look at data from Singapore, 40 years ago, Singapore was a place that met its own labour needs. In 1970, the non-resident population of the country was less than 3%. By 2010, it had risen to 26%, and in 2013 reached 29%. And in that year, 2013, there were 1.3 million foreign workers in Singapore, representing around about 40% of the total workforce. Migrants in Singapore face discrimination and often public prejudice. Following the first riots, I imagine they were probably reported here in Thailand, following the first riots in more than 3 decades in Singapore in December of last year by labour migrants from South Asia, one reader to the Straits Times wrote this: "Foreign workers are here to make a living, and they should do just that instead of creating trouble. foreign workers need to know that they cannot import their culture or their way of life here to Singapore. And on the kind of social media, there was an outpouring, and you could see behind it this sort of feeling that really the migrants who are so critical to Singapore's development were unwelcome sort of denizens of the Singapore city-state. Partly reflecting such public views, most countries have policies and laws that seek to limit migrant numbers, control their employment, channel their activities, and maintain a degree of surveillance over their daily lives. This then creates a second paradox. Laws are put in place ostensibly to protect migrant workers, but in practice these laws become a means by which employers can restrict and exploit their workers. And I think, again, people in this room will know more about this than I do, but I think this is reflected in the scores of factories that are sprouted along the borders of Thailand and Myanmar. And Arnold and Pickles write this about the factories in Mae Sot and around Mae Sot. It's a quintessential example of a garment-producing centre that attracts employers keen on squeezing or sweating labour. The third paradox also emerges from the legal context that exists in most destination countries. Migrants are by definition mobile, and yet their daily mobility becomes tightly circumscribed. Anushka Dirks writes The Politics of Immobilization and quotes a Cambodian working on a Thai trawler when he says this: living here means that we don't have rights, we don't have much freedom, we have no clear time frame. When we work for them, the fishing vessel owners, it is all up to them. When they want us to stop for several months, for years, it is up to them. This sort of sense that people are mobile, that has brought them to countries like Singapore and Malaysia and Thailand, but the politics of their presence means that they're immobilized. At one level, it's clear that globalization and capitalism shape the processes and outcomes discussed here. The fact of growing mobility and migration and the ways in which migrant labor sojourners are implicated in and insinuated into national development projects are quite clearly tied up with broader currents of economic transformation. And you can kind of see that reflected in the debate in Singapore over whether foreign domestic workers should have a day off. Only last year did the Singapore government think that it actually might be quite good to legislate for workers to have a day off. But they were worried about how people would respond to this, as in Singaporean employers. So they have a kind of get-out clause, which is this, where they say they brought it in line with international accepted practice, while providing flexibility to employers and foreign domestic workers who wish to accept monetary compensation in lieu of their rest day. I mean, the idea that somehow a migrant worker can negotiate with their employer to have or not to have a rest day is hard to believe. And this was one of the sort of campaigns in Singapore to give foreign domestic workers a rest day. And you can see a comment I put in here from one of the employers where she writes, "This is bad news for women who are working. If I let her go out 4 days a month, it will be very hectic for me. I need to rest on Sunday too." So you can see how it's kind of worked out in the context of Singapore. Economic growth in the countries of Southeast Asia that receive large numbers of transnational migrants, so Brunei Darussalam, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, has been importantly founded on cheap flows of labor. The incomes of these migrants are not recorded in national statistics, and their poverty therefore goes unreported. But it is the poverty of these new poor who in a real sense have helped to make the old poor non-poor. I mean, just consider the numbers. Malaysia in 2010 had a population of 600,000 living beneath the $2 a day poverty line. In the same year, there were more than 3 million transnational migrant workers who were probably earning close to or less than that figure. They're not recorded as poor. And I've got similar sort of stats here as well for Thailand, Brunei, and Singapore. So when we see on cans of tuna, produced in Thailand, maybe there should be a little rider I put here, fished by Cambodians and Burmese. When we look at, jeans made in Thailand, made in Malaysia, well, this should be made in Malaysia. Maybe it's sewn by Vietnamese. And of course, those people born in Singapore, those Singaporeans, have been raised by Filipinos. Of course, that's never added on. point out that transnational migrant workers in Southeast Asia are vulnerable and open to abuse is hardly novel. It's been extensively documented for years. Furthermore, it's not just a Southeast Asian affliction, and it's echoed time and again across the world. If you go into if you go to Singapore, go to the Asian Civilizations Museum. If you go kind of upstairs, you could pass a diorama of what conditions were like for sort of Chinese migrants to Singapore during the British colonial period. This is a picture that I took of the diorama, and you can see them crammed into these kind of dormitories. These are latter-day dormitories of migrant workers now in Singapore. And look at the kind of similarities between the conditions of those first Chinese migrants back in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, and the lessons, if you like, that the Asian Civilizations Museum are trying to make, send, inform school children and visitors to that museum, and then what's happening just around the corner from the museum as Singapore industrializes and modernizes. What on first glance may appear perplexing is that notwithstanding very significant extensions to the legislative frameworks in both Singapore and Thailand and Malaysia, ostensibly designed to protect migrant workers from abuse, both continue and at a wide level. Appreciating this legislative failure requires that we view international labour migration in terms of the neoliberal context that underpins and drives the process. Wages are poor, conditions are dangerous, because they need to be in the context of neoliberal growth. Regulations are put in place because migrants are needed, but not wanted. And laws that might protect workers are either lacking or poorly policed, because the conditions in which migrants work are not of central public anxiety, and therefore of political concern. I think, I'll bring this to a close now, because it's just about 22. I think for kind of sort of reflecting on the poverty successes and failures of Southeast Asia, I think that this region's done extraordinarily well, and the wider East Asian region, in reducing absolute poverty. And I think it's often left at that poverty's come down from 70% to 12%. Surely we must count that as success, and I think that's right. I think in coming to that view, though, we're missing some of the really key challenges that face this region, face all of us, in a sense, and governments and countries. Because it doesn't mean that poverty has disappeared. In a sense, it's been reshaped in new ways. And the reason why that's happened is often linked to the wealth and the prosperity that has also come with development. Thank you very much.
Professor Jonathan Rigg has finished before his allotted time, and he would like to welcome if you can have a few questions. If you want to ask a question, please come to the microphones and introduce yourself.
Western Washington University. I'm curious, I know this is a work in progress, so I'm wondering if you're considering also including the idea of unreported or invisible resources that are being lost to people who are poor. So the simple things like protein intake that doesn't get counted because it never goes through the market system. And have you thought about how that might be incorporated in this model that you're developing?
I haven't even thought about including protein. No, that hasn't been on my agenda. I thought you were going to ask a different question when you started, which was about the way in which, if like natural resources get relocated from one country to another. For example, if you look at sand mining in Cambodia, the effects of sand mining on local livelihoods, the destruction of fisheries, and the way in which, of course, that sand ends up, I don't want to bang on about Singapore, but it ends up in Singapore, if you like, growing the nation state of Singapore in physical terms. And that enables Singapore to do things, but it kind of resonates back to Cambodia. If you think of the haze from last year, which affected Malaysia and so on, which comes from the clearance of land for palm oil, I mean, that's often, I mean, it's foreign capital, much of it Singaporean and Malaysian, which in a sense is driving that process. So there are invisible kind of trans-border flows and links. So I'm going to focus on that. I haven't got to that chapter yet. But I hadn't thought about protein before. But I am interested in thinking about how, if you like, environmental challenges are now, I mean, the obvious one, of course, is climate change, but environmental challenges now require us to look across national borders. I mean, and I suppose here in Thailand, the logging ban of, was it 1989, and the effects of that in terms of displacing logging into Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. So you solve one problem, and you create 3 more. So I am looking at that. So partial answer, sorry.
Is there any other question? Yeah, please. Professor Rujira.
Thank you for such an informative paper. My work is on India, and I can see lots of resonances there too. And I'm also reminded by Jan Bremen's classic article on the informal sector, when you were talking about there's nothing informal about or there's nothing formal about the informal sector. So in this sense, it seems to me that it's classic capitalism repeating itself, the only exception being migrant labour. And in, I guess, labour surplus economies like the subcontinent, the poverty is visible. In Southeast Asia, it's invisible. Other than that, it is actually neoliberal capitalism on a global scale, seeing its manifestation in a particular way. So it's just a comment, and just in terms of observation, what I see in Southeast Asia is that poverty is hidden. It's there, but it's hidden, and it's being done by somebody else. And I also work on the garment sector, so it's, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think that's right. It is, I mean, you're correct in saying the way that it's hidden from view. When I talk to my students in Singapore, and I often ask, give them the leading question, are there any poor in Singapore? And they say, no, of course there aren't. But, and then we get to discuss it, and they suddenly begin to say, yeah, well, of course, I do know that there are these people who are sort of hidden from view, who we might count as poor. And I suppose that's repeated in other countries as well. I mean, I think one of the, I didn't really go into it in detail, but the whole kind of dispossession issue, and, you know, accumulation by dispossession, which is part of the taking of land. But I think a lot of the accumulation in East Asia has occurred without dispossession. So people still, although people are losing their land in Laos, I mean, here in Thailand, for example, people are not losing their land, but they're still being incorporated into the capitalist system. So I think it's an interesting way in which we can maybe draw a distinction between, if you like, accumulation by dispossession and accumulation without dispossession. And I think that without dispossession is a particular feature of East Asian growth. And probably, I don't know about South Asia, but I mean certainly different to, say, Latin America and Africa, particularly Latin America. So maybe there are a few interesting distinctions between the regions and about how capitalism operates in different regional contexts. But your point is a good one. Thank you.
Yeah, I found this a fascinating presentation addressing a lot of issues with new perspectives regarding poverty. And you've been highly critical of the development and the capitalist economy as the force producing or reproducing poverty. Could you maybe outline a bit your view of an alternative and more positive development?
Wow. Yeah. It's always dangerous, isn't it, asking academics to, well, what's the answer? What's the alternative? I hadn't thought about that. I still think, if you like, market relations, market incorporation, marketization has delivered, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, North Korea provides a kind of alternative to what we see. So I mean, I'm not going that far. But I think that there are a set of hidden processes that people, I suppose, need to think hard about their effects on people and places. Yeah. So I think, I suppose I'm going to be really banal here, but a kind of softer type of capitalism, dare I say it, more like a kind of European model, where the effects of capitalism on excluded groups, on vulnerable groups, has to be kind of acknowledged and not just pushed to the margins and ignored. So I'm not suggesting that market relations capitalism is, there's some alternative to that, but I think it can be addressed in policy terms. I mean, I've only been, it's funny, when you arrive in a new country, you kind of see it afresh. I mean, I've only been in Singapore for 6 months, but it's amazing the debates that go on there about, should, as I said very briefly, should, sort of domestic workers have a day off? I mean, to me, yeah, come on, it's obvious. Of course they should. And yet it's amazing that that debate is going on. And then they come to the decision, well, actually employers can decide not to give them a day off effectively if it gets in the way of their everyday life. And to me, that is not, that's where the state needs to come in and provide the corrective. And I think that can then be extended into multiple different arenas. I mean, that's an inadequate answer to a huge question, but I'm not saying that there's, I don't have a kind of alternative to market relations and market integration, but I think some of the excesses can be tempered.
Yes, I see the hand raised over there. Can anyone give him the microphone?
I'm aware that it's now almost 10 to. So we've got other panels, so but I don't. Okay, two more.
Okay, I'm Poi Hong from the Geography Department of National Taiwan University, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question is that, is this group of people, they try, right now it seems to me in your presentation they are invisible, okay? But at the same time, are they trying to gather together, try to make themselves visible and to try to, fight for their rights or something like that? Because I'm from Taiwan. For example, in Taiwan, more and more migrant workers, they go to Taiwan and work. And originally, they could be invisible, but the increasing population has made them try to get together and, initiate something like association or something and try to fight for themselves. But I'm just curious about, is there similar things happening in your presentation? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I mean, certainly yes. I mean, they're not invisible. I mean, we're all here and people in this room have studied them. And there are non-governmental organizations that fight for their rights. And there have been attempts to create, I mean, sort of Filipino workers in Hong Kong, for example, have been very successful in that regard. I suppose I was kind of thinking of invisible in two ways. I mean, one, invisible that they're pushed to the margins in a kind of physical sense, but also invisible in that they don't appear in the statistics. Yeah, these are not people who count. So when you look at levels of poverty in Singapore, for example, 0% living on less than, it doesn't recognize that there are actually 1.3 million people who are probably not living off far that figure because they're not, citizens of the state. The state sort of feels, well, it's not our responsibility to worry about them. So the invisibility is both, if you like, a statistical one relating to counting, and the other one is more of a physical one relating to the fact about, they live in dormitories, they're at the margins of the state, they tend to eat in particular places, they don't get seen in the way that they might if they were in the mainstream. So I meant it in both those ways.
I think that we have the last question from the gentleman at the middle.
Yes, I'm Frédéric Bourdier, anthropologist working in Cambodia. What you mentioned about the three paradox can be applied not only for transnational migrants, but also, at least in Cambodia, for immigrants, people. Not only they are unwelcome in terms of access to different services, including health services, and someone here in the assembly is working on that issue. There are also new regulations which are proposing but implementing new regulation called security drafting measurements, which are considering migrants as potential troublemakers, in which police and also military are supposed to control those people who are coming from outside. And third, also, even if those people are coming here as a mobile, either temporary or long-term migrants, they are not all their action in working purpose in terms of either innovation, because some of them are creating new opportunities, proposing diversifications in different activities in agriculture, for instance, but they are not at all recognized in that world. And also, I will be at a fourth paradox, which is maybe not visible everywhere. This is what we have seen, at least in one province where we are working, which is a province where indigenous people are living in the northeastern part of Cambodia. Now, there are more and more groups, including NGOs, who are starting and working on how local groups, not only indigenous, but also local Cambodian people, can be protected from these unwelcome people. So, even at the institutional levels, this kind of separation is enforced by not only NGOs, even by some international agencies and governments together.
Yeah, no, that's nice, and I'm sure you're right about immigrants coming in. I mean, I've never worked in Cambodia. I mean, I've read, obviously, work on it, but I've never done field work myself there. But I'd like to think that some of the themes that I was looking at in this can also be seen reproduced in a Cambodian context.
No, and maybe this trend is increasing in Cambodia, actually, because according to the official statistics, more than 35% of the national population is moving. The circulation of people is increasing, and so far the country has some difficulties to deal with the population, how to do with them, how to control also the population.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of control issue. Security issues get raised. I mean, here in Thailand as well, there are debates about it, troublemakers and all that sort of stuff. And I think the kind of wider question, if you like, how do denizens become citizens? And of course, so many policies prevent that happening. I mean, it's in my head at the moment, to go back to these foreign domestic workers, that they have to have a pregnancy test before they arrive in Singapore, because they do not want foreign domestic workers to have children in Singapore, because then, God forbid, they might become Singaporean. They're not allowed to marry without the permission of the Singapore state. They're not allowed to marry Singaporeans. So these are all ways in which, that shift of denizens into citizens, which have been such a feature of kind of human history, gets kind of stopped because of all those sorts of fears. You're absolutely right. Right, sorry I've kept you a while. Thank you. I think we better stop there, hadn't we? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Jonathan Rigg. Now I would like to invite Associate Professor Pongphetanasin, the Dean of the Faculty of Social Science, to give a token of appreciation to Professor Jonathan. The The next session is Plenary 2, Contestation and Convergence in Asia and the Pacific. The chair of this Plenary 2 is Professor Nalini Tantuwanit from Thammasat University. I would like to invite Professor Nalini to come up on the stage and invite the speakers of the plenaries.
Good morning, and don't let me be here alone, please. Professor Porio, Professor Heng, and Professor Mbong, please. Good morning, everyone, and obviously, I'm not Surichai Wun'gaeo. He has to run to another session and ask me to do this job. And then you'll see that how dangerous it is to be too close to the senior colleague. But I'm glad to be here anyway. Our session is closely relates to Professor Rigg's keynotes concerning poverty, inequality, political instabilities. If that is not dark enough, we have 3 more speakers here to further the discussion. I would like to introduce first Professor Emma Porio from Antonio de Manila. Professor Porio is also an executive committee of International Sociological Association and will be the first one who give a talk. Second, Professor Heng Siam Heng from National Chung Sing University, Taiwan. And our third speaker is Professor Rahman Mbong from University of Kimpangsaan, Malaysia. Professor Mbong has been a president of Social Science Association of Malaysia. Okay, let's hear from each speaker for the first round, 15 minutes each. And then we'll allow the comments, complaint, whatever, from all. And the last part will be back to the stage for another 5 minutes each. So the first round is about 15 minutes.
I'll try.
Let's go.
I planned for 20.
I'll make